All right, this presentation is a bit of a catch-all unit known as current issues. So as of 2018, these are the issues and concerns that the world is grappling with. And we're going to start with environmental issues. If you take a look at the 12 o'clock position, Green Revolution, that's where we're going to start. And the Green Revolution is the third revolution that concerns food. If you remember at the beginning of ninth grade, you talked about the Neolithic Revolution. That's where people started farming and domesticating animals. That the second food-related revolution was the agricultural revolution. That's the one that took place around the time of the Industrial Revolution. That's where they started to change the techniques and technologies used on used on farms. So, for example, this included things like crop rotation and the seed drill, and there was a change in law in Britain known as the Enclosure Law, and all of these things led to larger farms that produced a lot more food using fewer workers, and the agricultural revolution kind of paved the way for the Industrial Revolution. Now, if that sounds familiar, great. If it doesn't, I would invite you to please take a look at the Industrial Revolution presentation. Anyway, for now, we're going to really focus on the Green Revolution. And the Green Revolution is focused on this period in the 1940s and 1960s where new technology is being used in farms. So this is things like fertilizers, chemical pesticides, GMOs. These are genetically modified plants and seeds. And these technologies have, again, greatly increased the amount of food being produced on farms. So one of the things, the Green Revolution, again, has some pros and cons. On the pro side, as I said, more food is being produced. Things like chemical pesticides, just keeping down the amount of bugs and things that can infect the plants and kill them off. Fertilizers, allowing land that normally would not produce food to be able to, again, just be able to be valuable farmland, and GMOs. This is this ability to affect the genetic codes of seeds and plants, and in such a way that they can survive in environments that normally would kill off a plant or make them more resistant to disease and things like that, has been very instrumental in increasing the world's food supply. But let's start. One of the issues that comes up a lot when you talk about this is, well, let's get the first one out of the way, which is the GMOs. And again, this is that you're modifying the genetic codes of certain plants. If you look at the top right, you don't even have to look at the top right. If you've ever been to a supermarket, I'm sure you've seen their sections of the produce area where organic foods are being sold. And you can see organic generally costs more. And that's because a lot of people really hate the idea of ingesting foods that have a lot of fertilizers, that have, that have used chemicals and so on to affect the food. People who are anti-GMO, they'll call these kinds of genetically modified foods, they'll refer to them as frankenfoods. They're really concerned that these foods, as we get away from nature, that they could have unintended consequences that can affect people's health. Now, on the other side of this, there are a lot of scientists who argue that that's not true. That in fact, GMOs have benefited humanity greatly. For example, if you see the picture in the middle on the right, this example of a GMO is where you can actually create a variety of corn that is more drought resistant. So it uses less water. And on the bottom left, again, a lot more foods than you may realize are GMOs. And because of this, it increases the amount of food that's produced. It reduces the amount of land that needs to be set aside for agriculture. and so on and so forth, that they would argue that it's been of a benefit. One of the other issues that comes up with GMOs is regarding the use of fertilizers. Again, a lot of these nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, they're going to take land that normally would not be able to produce food, and by using these chemicals, you can now produce food on land that normally would sit barren. One of the issues that's come up is there are some people who argue that the overuse of these fertilizers can have a really negative effect on the soil. That one of the issues we're going to look at later is desertification. This is where the balance of different organisms that make up soil, once that balance is destroyed, it can lead the soil to become kind of dependent on these fertilizers, and can allow the land to basically really hurt the land over the long term, and in fact has a very significant negative effect on the environment. Another issue that comes up with regard to the green revolution is the fact that, the use of these chemical fertilizers and pesticides and things, they can be very expensive. So many parts of the world that are very poor, that actually need increased food production, are the same countries that cannot afford to use these kinds of technologies, these advanced technologies. That these same farmers who need to increase their yields are the same ones who are too poor to use these advanced technologies. So again, I would definitely not call myself an expert on this, and I would not recommend looking for information on this on the internet, because God only knows what you'll find. But certainly if you want to ask your science teacher for more detail about this, if you're interested in it, feel free. All right, the next topic we're going to look at is deforestation. And really the answer about what deforestation is really caught up in the name. It's where we are deforesting. We're getting rid of forests. Now, one of the issues, this is for purposes of the regions, they really focus on this as an issue in the Amazonian rainforest, and that's of course located in South America, although it does occur in other parts of the world as well. And deforestation has a significant impact with regard to climate change. Now, before I go any further, I know I'm releasing this on the internet, and there are people out there who do not believe in climate change. To quote the great scientist Neil deGrasse Tyson, the good thing about science is that it's true whether or not you believe it. So I believe in climate change. I teach in New York, so I'm allowed to teach about climate change. The New York State Regents it is based on the fact that climate change exists. So if you're uncomfortable with this discussion, feel free to hit stop and find another video. But all right, with that, I'm going to move on. So as I said, the destruction of the Amazonian rainforest has been having a really significant impact globally. All right, so you have these areas of forests, and again, when you start clearing out these forests, it takes mere seconds to clear out huge numbers of trees that take hundreds of years to grow. So once these forests are gone, it's not a matter of just, well, we'll replant them and they'll come back. It's not that simple. And not only, obviously one of them, as I was saying earlier, one of the big impacts this has is on climate change. Climate change is caused by an increase in carbon in the atmosphere. And if you remember from science class, plants breathe in carbon dioxide and breathe out oxygen. So as a result, the more forests we have, the more carbon can be removed from the atmosphere. And conversely, the more trees we cut down, the more carbon is going to be able to be built up. Not only that, one of the other issues, again, to the top right, as we get rid of all these forests, we're getting rid of the natural habitat where a lot of animals live. And so it's doing a lot of damage to the earth. So people might ask, well, then why don't we just keep the forests? Well, this is the issue, is that when you look at the countries that have a lot of forest left, a lot of these countries are ones that are just currently now moving forward with industrialization. They're very often poorer countries that need the cash that cutting down forests produce. So what do I mean by that? If I start at the bottom left, one reason you would cut down rainforest is to make space to graze cattle. To the right of that, another reason is to clear land so that you can put up plantations, very large plantations, and create farmland. To the bottom right, when you clear cut forests, when you get rid of all these trees, you can use the trees for industrial purposes. So, producing paper products and lumber. And then finally, too, sometimes these forests get cleared so that you can build housing. And all of these things generate great wealth for the countries that have these forests. But yet, um, at the same time, the world globally, we benefit from having more forests, right? So, there's a cute little posting here. But the idea is that, I mean, if we need oxygen to breathe, you would think, well, what's more valuable, having $1 million or having oxygen? I mean, it seems kind of silly, right? Who would, oh yeah, I'll just stop breathing. Thank goodness I'm rich. I mean, as my mother says, there's no luggage rack on a Hertz. But when you look at it from the country's perspective, is it in the individual country's interests to keep a forest, which produces very little money, versus cutting down the forest and generating great wealth for their economy? So that's, again, this is a global issue that really is important, although the world has an interest in maintaining forests, the individual countries where those forests are located, they have an interest in cutting them down. So that's something that we're grappling with. Another big issue is that of desertification. Now, one of the issues is when people talk about deserts, most people would assume naturally that a desert is from nature, that it's not something that man has a role in, when in fact that's not true. In fact, a lot of deserts are man-made. What we're seeing is that man's actions are having the effect of increasing the size of deserts. So, for example, in Africa, the Sahara, granted, is a natural phenomena, right? The Sahara was created. And what happens is the border area of the Sahara is known as the Sahel region. Sahel region is very dry, it's an arid, and it's very hot. So these kind of tropical arid areas of the world, what we're finding is that man's actions, so things like cutting down all the forests, overusing fertilizer, and certain farming techniques have the effect of increasing the size of deserts. So what do I mean by that? When you cut down forests, remember, trees, not only do their roots hold soil, but their leaf cover also keeps the land from being dried out. When it comes to the overuse of fertilizer, again, when you pull all the nutrients out of the soil, you're left with desert. And then finally, farming techniques. One of the things is, if you've ever seen, when a farmer pulls a till, right, you cut open the land, the dirt has it comes up and almost is like two waves that, kind of spill out, right? And when you cut the land like that, when you spread the land like that, now you're spreading out soil and you're exposing it to the heat. You're allowing the soil to dry out. And again, that can produce deserts. All right, from there we're going to move on to the loss of the ozone layer. I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but this is the issue where the use of certain chemicals like CFCs, sometimes you'll see that in aerosol cans, like no CFCs, but that's a type of chemical that has been able to help destroy our ozone layer. The destruction of the ozone layer is why you really need to wear sunscreen when you go out in outside at all. The destruction of the ozone layer has allowed more cancer-causing rays to penetrate, and this is why we're seeing higher and higher numbers of skin cancer come out. And, because I mean, think about it logically. Do you honestly think that like cavemen and women kind of slathered themselves up with sunscreen, before they walked around? No. But the environment has changed, and people need to be, that's one of the issues that man-made pollution has affected the environment. Okay, another thing that has come up on the Regents before is the issue of biofuels. So what do I mean by that? The next time you go to a gas station, if you keep an eye out, you'll often see like a little sticker that says, 10% of this gas is ethanol. So the question is, well, what is ethanol? Ethanol is a fuel that is produced from corn. So now, naturally you would think, okay, well, that sounds genius. Instead of getting oil from the ground, which is a resource that's eventually going to run out, corn is something that we just keep on growing. So why don't we just produce fuel that way? Two issues with it. One issue is that the amount of energy it takes to convert corn into fuel is so high. Some scientists argue, it's not worth it. The other issue that sometimes comes up with the issue of biofuel is if you're using corn to produce fuel, that means there's less corn for people to eat. So it's certainly an area, that people are going to continue to research when we start looking at looking for alternatives to using fossil fuels. But as I said, it has some pros and cons. Last issue we're talking about is climate change. And as I said before, I'm not going to kind of play the game. Climate change is real. You disagree, feel free to stop the video now. And for a while, climate change used to be referred to as global warming, but that kind of was it gave people this kind of artificial thought, like, oh, well, you mean it's going to be hot all the time, and that's simply it. When really it's a much larger issue than that, although that is a significant piece of it. To understand climate change, the first thing that's important to know is the difference between weather and climate. My mom lives in Florida. The climate there is hot. Now, does that mean that every day is a tropically hot day? No, of course. One day it could be raining and cold, and one day it could, you could have frost. But overall, the climate is hot. The pattern is that you normally have hot days. Well, that's the same idea. With climate change is this idea that based on your location on the globe, the pattern, you're going to have a certain pattern of temperatures that you should expect. And what we're seeing is due to an increase in carbon in the atmosphere, an increase in carbon that has been caused by the burning of fossil fuels, it has changed weather patterns, all right? And this burning of fossil fuels, the reason we've seen this is because the climate has been changing, and the amount of carbon in the atmosphere started growing after the Industrial Revolution. There's always been certain variations in climate, but these very severe changes and kind of radical change that we're seeing really started after the Industrial Revolution, which is why climate change is tied to man-made actions. And just to be clear, climate change has a wide variety of impacts to the globe. It's not just simply, you're going to have more warm days. In California, they're experiencing a rash of wildfires that has been very, very dangerous. We're seeing animals, fish, their habitats being affected. So things like, for example, in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef is starting to bleach out. Certain sections of it are dying off. Animals' migration patterns are changing. In New York, we're seeing higher pollen counts and more mosquitoes because, normally when you have an extended cold winter, that period of time is going to allow for pollen counts to go down. It's going to allow, a lot of insects will die during that winter. And therefore, when spring comes back, then the pollen and the insects would be much more limited. Now that we're seeing a much milder winters, that's impacting the number of insects that are born. It's impacting pollen counts and things like that. Sea level rise. What we're starting to see is a lot of the polar ice caps, the glaciers are melting at a much faster rate. And so there's a lot more coastal flooding. One area of the world that has been significantly impacted, for example, is Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country that has a very low sea level just generally. But beyond that, it's also a very flat country. So as sea level rise, it's having a much greater impact on Bangladesh. So areas of the country where people used to live, now they're evacuating, they're moving into the cities. And that's a big issue because the cities were overcrowded to begin with, and now it's even worse. We're also seeing this, as floodwaters rise, it's impacting the availability of fresh water. Um, there are certain areas like the Maldives where they're afraid, it's an island nation, they're afraid that their island is going to be underwater soon. So there's a lot of people who are really concerned about that. And again, crop changes, that certain crops, for example, I just saw something on the news about wine regions, that wine regions in Europe, especially in France, wine has to be grown, wine grapes have to be grown at a temperature, a certain temperature within a certain a certain temperature, and the climate has to be just so. And what we're seeing with climate change is as the temperature is getting warmer, it's there's greater drought, there's less water. A lot of the wine grapes are dying off. In fact, in many parts of our country, like Texas and things like that, drought conditions are much more severe and much more frequent. So it's having a big impact. So definitely something to be aware of. Again, I would not recommend going to the internet for information about climate change, or just be careful. I mean, because, let's be real. What's the big cause of climate change? Well, you just heard me, the burning of fossil fuels. I mean, if, that's one of the biggest money-making industries ever, the oil industry. So naturally, if you're an oil executive, you have a lot of money, a lot of power, you don't want people talking about climate change because that's going to hurt your business. And naturally, if you work in a coal mine or you work on an oil rig, there's a lot of people where if we move away from fossil fuels, it's going to affect their jobs. It's going to affect their careers. So, there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to talk about climate change, and there's a lot of money behind, denying that it exists. But the reality is climate change is real. Now, what we do about it, that's a political decision. And there's not necessarily one right answer. It's not like, okay, well, if there's climate change, that means we're going to make oil illegal. There might be technological solutions that we can find to mitigate the effects of climate change. There might be ways to reverse it. But to find those solutions, we have to admit there's a problem. And, that's what we're kind of dealing with right now. That's what we're struggling with. So, all right, moving on. So from the environment, now we're going to move on to economic issues. So first thing we're going to start with is OPEC. OPEC stands for the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And petroleum is just a fancy way of saying oil, all right? And let's put it this way. If I told you to buy me a pair of sneakers, right? And you went to pick out a pair of Air Jordans versus a pair of Skechers, the reality is the Air Jordans are going to end up costing more money. More people would want the pair of Air Jordans versus the Skechers. Not to say that Skechers isn't a lovely pair of sneakers, but you get what I'm saying. Because there's a difference. There's a difference between those two. But if I told you, hey, pick me up a gallon of, gas, do I care whether it's brand A or brand B? No, I don't care. So you're going to choose what oil to buy based on price. All right? Well, here's the thing. The oil exporting countries recognize this as well. And so they said, okay, this is silly. If instead of competing against each other and all of us lowering our prices to increase the number of people who will buy from us, why don't we work together? Why don't we form an organization? And then as a group, we can decide what price we'll sell oil at, how much oil we'll produce, and so on. That way, all of us can make more money. And that's what OPEC ended up doing. Because again, like I said, you should remember from, again, the study of the Industrial Revolution, the study of capitalism, If you remember that, you'll remember that in a free market, the price is determined by supply and demand. Okay, price is determined by supply and demand. So the demand for oil is very, very high. Okay, a lot of people need it. People are going to buy it. So the other determinant of what oil is going to cost is going to be the supply. Now, oil is is stored underground. So how much oil you pull out of the ground, that's going to determine price. If you pull a lot of oil out of the ground, you're increasing the supply of oil for sale, prices go down. If you pull less oil out of the ground and you offer less oil for sale, the price is going to go up. So that's what OPEC does. As a group, they decide how much, what supply of oil they're going to make available, and that way to make sure that all of the members of OPEC make more money. Now, one of the other issues that you get with OPEC is, now that they're working as a group, one of the things OPEC has the option of doing is setting an oil embargo. An oil embargo means they decide they're not going to sell you oil. And this happened to the United States. The countries of OPEC were mad at the United States, decided to have an oil embargo, and said, we're not going to sell you oil. And of course, that had a huge negative impact on the United States because we needed oil, so it created huge shortages, had a big impact on our economy. So OPEC isn't just an economic organization. Because the oil is so important, it gives OPEC a lot of political power as well. All right, the next thing we're going to take a look at is NAFTA. NAFTA stands for the North American Free Trade Agreement. And you should be aware, North America is made up of predominantly 3 countries, right? It's made up of Canada, United States, Mexico. All right, so what happens is normally the United States, Mexico, Canada, 3 separate countries, their economies would be completely separate and we would compete against each other. And what happens is President Clinton, under his administration, the 3 countries in North America decided to work together. And they decided that they would have greater, what they say, economic integration. So what happens is they decided to reduce trade barriers. So for example, something like a tariff, right? A tariff is a tax that a country puts on imported goods. So for example, if Mexico wanted to sell goods inside America, an American would have to pay whatever the cost is for the goods plus the tariff. So that would reduce the demand for Mexican goods inside the United States. Similarly, if the United States sold something in Canada and Mexico, they could put a tariff on our goods, so people would be less likely to buy American goods. But with NAFTA, all of those trade barriers go away. And in some ways, a lot of people who are pro-NAFTA say, well, this has been great for American business. This has allowed corporations, American corporations, to increase the amount of goods that they sell, and this has been, a benefit to the American economy. But critics of NAFTA said, okay, well, one of the issues has been American companies that used to be based in the United States because of the tax laws and because of all these different regulations. Now, with NAFTA, those things are gone. So instead of locating their factories and manufacturing goods inside the United States, a lot of these factories have decided to move to Mexico. And the idea is that in Mexico, the cost of hiring labor is a lot less. Here in the United States, right, minimum wage is, around $10, more than $10. But in Mexico, the people will take much, much less. So some critics say that the NAFTA has had the effect of moving a lot of corporations and outsourcing and offshoring a lot of jobs. So it kind of goes, it can go both ways. There are pros and cons to it. As you may be aware, Donald Trump has been a very outspoken critic of NAFTA, so there's great potential for this to be renegotiated, and it's certainly something that can change, so keep an eye out in the news for more information about how NAFTA is going to change. All right, the next thing we're going to take a look at is the European Union. This is kind of the European equivalent to NAFTA, so what do I mean by that? Europe Similarly, the countries, the economies of Britain and France and Germany and Greece and many other countries within Europe, they used to operate completely separately. So now, just like the United States with the Nafta did, the European countries removed trade barriers between each of their nations. So you're eliminating tariffs. And as from a business economic perspective, instead of operating separately, they operate as one, as if they're like one big country for purposes of business. And so again, just like NAFTA, the European Union, the goal of this, creating this kind of union, is to increase the wealth, increase profits for different countries, right? Benefit everybody. Well, again, like NAFTA, there are certain positive and negative impacts of the European Union. When the European Union decided to work together, it creates a much larger economy. So it's a much more powerful economy. The integration with the European Union is much more significant than with NAFTA. For example, in the European Union, instead of having different forms of money, so for example, when I traveled to Europe in 1991, when I went to England, I had to spend pounds. When I went to France, I had to spend francs, right? Different countries had different forms of money. With the development of the European Union, that changed, and now there's only euros. So the same form of money is used in all countries within the European Union. Similarly, as you traveled through Europe, instead of having to show your passport, it made traveling through the European Union much easier. That you could get an EU passport, and it made it much easier for people within the European Union to travel. But now there's been a big pushback from the European Union. A lot of members are unhappy with it. One issue is Greece. Greece, for example, has had a lot of economic problems. The country's basically bankrupt. It does not have a lot of money. And so in the old days, if Greece had economic trouble, well, that's Greece's problem. Today, however, Greece is a member of the European Union. So now Greece's problems don't just affect Greece, it affects every nation within the European Union. So even Germany and England are going to feel the effects of the Greek economic collapse, right? And the people of Greece aren't happy about this either, because if Greece was dealing with economic problems, then before the European Union, Greece would be the one to decide how they were going to handle that problem. But today you have Germany turning around and saying, okay, Greece, we need you to make these changes to improve your economy, and you need to cut this program, and you need to charge this tax, and so on and so forth. So this economic integration has, taken away a lot of the individual countries' power to determine how they're going to run their own economies. Another issue that's come up is something known as Brexit. What happens is the voters of England have decided that they want to step away, that they want to leave the European Union. That's where the name Brexit comes from, that they're going to exit. Britain is going to exit the European Union. And it's something that is really, really difficult. They're kind of negotiating that exit now. Some of the people who wanted to leave the European Union, one of the issues is things like making laws. So, for example, England is famous for the fact that these people love like fish and chips, for example. And so a lot of fishermen, work off the shore. England's a European nation. They used to fish and they dealt with British regulations. But lo and behold, once England joins the European Union, Britain no longer has the power to decide its own regulations. They have to follow regulations that have been negotiated among everyone in the European Union. And these regulations against fishermen, for example, are much harsher than the ones that England normally had. So this has hurt British fishermen. So they were one voting bloc who wanted to leave the European Union. Another issue that came up is in Europe, one of the things they're dealing with is the migrant crisis. There's a civil war going on in Syria. A lot of the people from Syria have left and have traveled to Greece and Italy and are trying to make their ways there and live within the European Union. Now, with the formation of the EU, the borders are what they say is a lot more porous. What that means is there's less security, there's less checkpoints, and it's much easier for migrants to kind of travel throughout Europe. And a lot of people within the EU want to have more control over their borders, want to control whether or not they accept a large number of migrants. So it's, yeah, so again, this issue of interdependence, again, it's made to increase profits and to benefit all the countries involved, but there's certainly pros and cons with it. Anyway, all of these things are kind of tied into the idea of globalization. Globalization is, again, this idea that every country's economy is no longer kind of stands alone, that one country's economic problems or successes have an impact on a wide number of other countries' economic, again, good or bad. If you take a look at this graphic of the Starbucks coffee cup, right? This is a great example of globalization. And it makes the argument that, a single cup of Starbucks coffee can depend on, goods that come from up to 19 different countries. When you look at where the coffee beans come from, where you look where the paper from the coffee cup comes from, when you look at all the countries that can produce the sugar that they use to produce that, go into the cup of coffee, and that's the idea that this is possible because of the new technologies that currently exist, the technologies that allow faster communication, faster shipping, and so on and so forth. In addition to the economic aspects of globalization, that different countries' economies are more and more interdependent, one of the other issues is also with globalization is the cultural impact this has. So, for example, it's 2018. The big blockbuster that just came out was the first, this big Avengers movie that came out, right? And, which one of the big stars is Captain America in it, right? Now, this is a really popular movie, but is that movie only going to be seen in the United States? No, that movie is going to be shown all over the world. And this is very common that we're sharing, this is allowing for greater cultural diffusion. And some people see this as a positive, but for many conservatives in certain countries, they see this as a negative, that they don't want to see culture, especially Western culture, kind of take over theirs, that they feel that this is can be a negative influence in their countries. Other people see it as a positive one, but that's the idea that these communication technologies, we're seeing more and more cultural diffusion, for better or for worse. All right, this is a graphic that's appeared on past regencies. And again, this is another kind of view of globalization, that you can have one company that gets supplies from all over the world, raw materials from all over the world. It can manufacture its products all over the world and sell these products all over the world. That more and more of these multinational corporations don't just exist in one place. Okay, I'm going to stop here. I'll finish this topic up in the next video, Current Issues Part 2.